The name is Bond. James Bond.
They filed his name in a cabinet of ash, stamped it gone with a practiced hand, buried the truth under codes and cash, and called it order, called it planned. They closed the doors, they killed the light, wrote the ending before the fall. But some men don't accept goodnight, some men don't stay dead at all. You can burn the files, you can wipe the screen, but there's always something in between. He's the man they couldn't delete, couldn't erase, couldn't make retreat. Every system lies, every record cheats, but he still walks every shadowed street. They try to end him line by line, but ghosts don't vanish, they just realign. He's the man they couldn't delete, and now he's coming for the truth beneath. Containers move in the dead of night, borders blink but never see. A heat signature in a world of white, a problem with no identity. They say he's gone, they say he's dust, say he's history, say he's done. But men like him don't rot, they rust. And then they move when the time has come, every line leaves a trace, every silence makes a sound, every empire cracks from the inside out. He's a man they couldn't delete, couldn't erase, couldn't make retreat. Every system lies, every record cheats, but he still walks every shadowed street. They try to end him line by line, but ghosts don't vanish, they just realign. He's the man they couldn't delete, and now he's coming for the truth beneath. Watch the river carry lights away, watch the city pretend it's clean. Some debts don't fade, they only wait. Some wars live in the in-between. You can call it over, call it close, call it justice, call it fate, but some men don't need a throne or a cause, they just don't know how to stop hating. Take on the clock, crack on the gun. History's not finished when you say it's done. He's a man they couldn't delete, couldn't erase, couldn't make retreat. He could hide the truth, you can change the beat, but the past still marches on concrete. They tried to end him line by line, but ghosts don't vanish, they just realign. He's the man they couldn't delete, but now he's crossing every line. You're true for peace. They'll call it fate, they'll call it chance, they'll call it something they don't understand. But in the end, when your lights all bleed, he's still there, the man they couldn't take.
North by North Korea. Park's Revenge. Prologue. The man who would not drown. Colonel Park did not die in the bathroom. This fact irritated him far more than the cracked ribs, the concussion, or the lingering taste of porcelain and chlorinated water that refused to leave his mouth. He lays on a narrow bed in a military infirmary on the outskirts of Pyongyang, staring up at a ceiling so aggressively while it looked like it had been scrubbed as punishment. The room smelled of antiseptic, boiled linens, and quiet panic, the signature perfume of institutional failure. Park hated hospitals. Hospitals where control went to apologize. His breathing was shallow. Each inhale sending a precise, irritating reminder through his chest and bones. Once broken, remembered the insult. His head throbbed steadily, not enough to incapacitate him, but enough to make sleep impossible. This too annoyed him. A nervous doctor hovered near the foot of the bed, pretending to review a clipboard, while very clearly reviewing his life expectancy. "You were fortunate, Colonel," the man said at last. Park turned his head a fraction. It felt like rotating a badly mounted artillery piece. "No," Park replied. "I was interrupted." The doctor nodded rapidly, gratefully for clarity. Interruptions were survivable. Failure was not. Park closed his eyes. James Bond. Park's jaw tightened. He opened his eyes again and swung his legs over the side of the bed. Despite the doctor's sharp intake of breath, the floor was cold. He welcomed it. Pain, at least, was honest. "I would like a cigarette," Park said. The doctor hesitated. "Colonel, the regulations..." Park looked at him. The doctor produced a cigarette as if by magic. Park took it, slid it between his lips, and lit it with slow, deliberate care. The flame flared briefly, reflected in his eyes. He inhaled. Smoke filled his lungs, harsh and grounding. It tasted of discipline, of habit, of control reclaimed. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl upward, softening the merciless white of the ceiling. In the smoke, the memory sharpened. Bond had not shouted, he had not ranted, he had joked. That was the unforgivable part. Violence was expected, pain was acceptable, even defeat in the right context could be endured. But mockery was chaos with manners. Park took another drag, ignoring the doctor's visible distress. James Bond had not simply escaped, he had left Park alive. This, Park understood with crystalline clarity, was not mercy, it was insult. A humiliation. Outside, somewhere beyond the sealed windows, a vehicle backfired. Park did not flinch. He exhaled the smoke through his nose and smiled faintly. The kind of smile that never reached the eyes and never promised anything good. Revenge, Park decided, should not be rushed. It should be patient, systematic, humiliating. Bond had enjoyed his cigarette. Park intended to make him choke on the smoke. He crushed the cigarette into the metal tray beside the bed with precise force, ground it out completely, and stood. "I want files," Park said. "I want roots. I want every scrap of information on James Bond." The doctor swallowed. "Yes, Colonel." Park turned towards the door, his reflection briefly visible in the polished steel, thinner, bruised, but intact. Alive, very much alive, and this time he would not be interrupted. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Ryongsong. The Ryongsong complex looked smaller in daylight. This irritated Colonel Park more than it should have. From a distance, the ruins appeared almost manageable. A collapsed wing here, a scorched facade there, smoke rising in thin, apologetic spirals, as though the place itself were embarrassed by the spectacle it had made of itself. The mountains behind it remained impassive, grey and ancient, as if they had seen far worse mistakes than this, and would see many more. Park stood at the edge of the exclusion zone, hands clasped behind his back, boots planted with ceremonial precision on frozen ground. His coat was immaculate, it always was. The smell of ash drifted faintly on the wind, mixing with burned insulation and melted wiring, the unmistakable perfume of failed ambition. He inhaled deeply. Failure had a smell. Officially, the Ryongsong disaster had already been explained. A system malfunction, unpatriotic maintenance, a regrettable convergence of electrical negligence and insufficient ideological vigilance. Park had helped write the statement himself. Unofficially, every man standing behind him knew the truth and prayed no one would ever ask them to say it out loud. Bond, a foreigner, had entered Ryongsong, a single man, and the system, Park's system, had folded around him like damp paper. A junior officer approached, boots crunching too loudly on the frost. He stopped, a careful distance away, clippered, clutched like a talisman. "Colonel?" the officer began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. Park did not turn. "Speak," Park said.
"The investigation committee would like your preliminary assessment before." Park raised a gloved hand. "I am standing in it."
The officer swallowed and waited. Park stepped forward and knelt, ignoring the protest flaring through his ribs. Pain was irrelevant. Pain was temporary. He brushed aside snow and picked up a fragment of metal, a twisted piece of housing. Once part of a containment unit, the surface was blistered. The edges melted into something almost organic. He turned it slowly in his hand. This piece had been expensive, carefully machined, installed by men who believed in precision. Bond had destroyed it casually, probably with a joke. Park closed his fingers around the fragment until it bit into the leather of his glove. He knew where to strike. Park said at last. He knew what mattered. "Yes, Colonel," the officer said quickly, scribbling. He had access, Park continued. Internal access. He anticipated our response times. He moved through the facility with confidence. Park rose, straightening with slow deliberation. This was not luck, he said, and it was not chaos. He turned at last, fixing the officer and the assembled investigators with his gaze. This was contempt. Silence followed. The kind of silence that understood it should not ask more questions. Park looked past them, over the ruins, imagining the path Bond had taken, the corridors he had walked, the doors he had opened, the moments where systems hesitated just long enough. Park could see it all with an unpleasant clarity. Bond had not panicked. He had not rushed. He had enjoyed himself. That, Park realized, was the true wound. Not the loss of Ryongsong, not the loss of Project Kalima, but the casual way Bond had treated it, as something temporary, disposable, almost amusing. "You will catalogue every failure," Park said, "every delay, every human error." "Yes, Colonel, and then," Park added softly, "you will forget this place ever existed." The officer nodded eagerly. Park turned away. The Ryongsong complex no longer mattered. Building could be rebuilt. Machines could be replaced. Men could be reassigned or erased. But humiliation? Humiliation required response. Park returned to his car, closed the door and allowed himself one indulgence. He flicked on a cigarette. The smoke filled the interior slowly, curling against the glass. Park watched it with detached interest. Smoke behaved honestly. It rose, it dispersed, it left nothing behind. Bond had done the opposite. Bond had entered, disrupted, and left memory. Park exhaled. Bond would not be hunted like an animal. That was crude, inelegant. Bond would be dismantled, piece by piece, system by system, until the world forgot him. Park crushed the cigarette into the ashtray and looked ahead as the car pulled away from the ruins. Ryongsong burned quietly behind him. Bond, somewhere far away, was undoubtedly relaxing. Park allowed himself a thin smile. "Enjoy it, Mr. Bond. You have already used up your luck." Interlude. The space between. The room smelled faintly of smoke and clean sheets. Bond stood by the open window, shirtless, cigarette held loosely between his fingers as London stretched itself into the night beyond the glass. The city hummed with the low, comforting noise of other people's lives, traffic, voices, distant music, all of it continuing without regard for what had nearly happened or what was about to. He exhaled slowly. Survival always came with excess energy. You either spent it or let it curdle. Behind him, the bed shifted. She hadn't spoken yet. She didn't need to. Bond crushed the cigarette into the ashtray, deliberately this time, and turned. She lay propped against the pillows, the sheet drawn up loosely, her dark hair against white linen. The lamp at the bedside cast a soft, forgiving light, that kind that hid bruises and made honesty feel optional. "You're thinking again," she said. Bond smiled faintly. "I make a habit of it." "You were almost killed," she replied. "Yes, and you're standing by the window smoking." He shrugged. "Old reflex, Sherry." She watched him for a moment, then reached out and touched his wrist, not to stop him, not to pull him closer, just to anchor him. "Come back," she said quietly. Bond let the silence sit between them for a moment longer, then crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't rush. He never rushed these moments. They were too rare. "You know this isn't permanent," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm not asking for promises." Her hand slid from his wrist to his forearm, then rested there, warm and certain. Bond covered it with his own, an unconscious gesture, protective rather than possessive. He leaned in, brushing a kiss against her temple first, then her cheek. The closeness was unhurried, unforced, two people choosing stillness in a life that rarely allowed it. She lifted her head, meeting him halfway. The kiss deepened, not desperate, not urgent, just present, that kind that said, "We are here now," and that was enough. Later, the world reduced itself to breath and warmth, and the quiet rhythm of being held. Bond lays on his back, one arm bent against his head, her weight light against his side. The sheet had slipped lower. Neither of them noticed when. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent but steady. She traced slow pattern on his chest, thoughtful. "You won't stay?" she said, not accusing him, just observant. "No," Bond replied honestly, "but I won't forget this." She smiled faintly. "Good, neither will I."
Bond reached instinctively for a cigarette, stopped himself, and let his hand fall instead to her shoulder, drawing her closer. For once, he didn't need smoke. The night deepened. The moment passed, as moments always did. Soon enough, Bond would put his shirt back on. Soon enough, he would step back into systems and violence and men who mistook control for strength. But for now, just this. A pause. A reminder.
And when he finally closed his eyes, it was not the weight of danger he felt, but the rare, disarming comfort of being known, briefly and without consequences. Chapter 2. London's too comfortable. James Bond disliked London most when it behaved itself. There was something profoundly unsettling about a city that pretended everything was in order, while quietly filing paperwork for a catastrophe. The streets were wet in the familiar way, the rain falling not so much from the sky as from habit. Red buses slid past with bored efficiency. Pedestrians keyed obediently, even when there was no clear reason to do so. Bond stood at the bar of his club, a martini in hand, watching his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. He looked rested. That was the problem. His suit was immaculate. Charcoal, Savile Row, cut to suggest effortlessness rather than expense. His hair was neat. The faint bruises from Ryongsong had faded to memories rather than warnings. Anyone watching him now would have assumed he was exactly what he appeared to be, a man enjoying a quiet drink in a city that did not know what he did for a living. Bond knew better. He lifted the glass, inhaled the sharp medicinal scent of gin and lemon, and took a slow sip. The drink was perfect, balanced, predictable, too predictable. Behind the bar, the barman polished the glass with the resigned patience of a man who had seen too many secrets pass without being invited to join them. "You look restless," the barman said quietly. Bond smiled faintly. "I am." "Bad job?" Bond considered the question. "No," he said. "A bad ending." The barman nodded wisely, deciding not to pursue that particular thread. Bond's gaze drifted to the newspaper propped open at the end of the bar. The headline was safely vague, heavy with denial. Diplomatic tensions rise in East Asia. Officials deny involvement. Bond snorted softly. Denying involvement, he reflected. Was diplomacy most reliable muscle memory? He finished the martini and signaled for another. As the glass was replaced, Bond's phone vibrated once against the polished wood. He did not rush to look at it. Rushing, Bond had learned, was for amateurs and men with something to lose. He picked up the phone at last. One word glowed on the screen. Alive. M. Bond closed his eyes briefly. There it was, the familiar tightening at the base of the skull, the instinctive recalibration of risk and inconvenience. Alive. Of course he was. Men like Colonel Park did not die easily. They endured. They adapted. They filed survivor under professional obligation. Bond exhaled slowly and slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Well," he murmured to no one in particular. "That's disappointing." The barman raised an eyebrow. "Another?" "Yes," Bond said, "and make it strong. I appear to have some unfinished business." Later in his flat, overlooking the Thames, Bond stood by the window smoking, watching the river carry reflections of streetlights downstream like discarded thoughts. The cigarette burned steadily between his fingers, the smoke curling upwards and softening the edge of the room. Bond enjoyed smoking at moments like this, not for the nicotine, but for the ritual. Light, inhale. Pause, exhale. Order imposed on chaos. Park smoked the same way. Bond smiled at the thought.
Somewhere between the second cigarette and the third, Bond accepted what his instincts had already concluded. Park was no longer a problem contained within borders. He was mobile, which meant the game had changed. Bond crushed the cigarette into the tray and reached for the secure phone. "M," he said when the line opened. "Yes," M replied immediately. "I assume you've received my message." "I have," Bond said. "He's alive." "Yes." "And annoyed." "Deeply." Bond nodded. "Good. That narrows things." M sighed on the other end. "Bond, officially, this matter is closed." "Of course it is," Bond said. "Unofficially," M continued, "we have noticed certain disturbances in financial networks across Eastern Europe." Bond smiled. "Park, that is our assessment."
Bond poured himself a small whiskey and leaned against the desk. "He's learnt," Bond said. "Ryongsong taught him something." "And what might that be?" That systems fail," Bond replied. "People don't. They just get bored." There was a pause. "You're going after him, Bond," M said. Bond took a sip of whiskey. "No," he said lightly. "I'm waiting." M did not sound convinced. Bond? He'll come to me, Bond said. Men like Park can't help themselves. He needs this to be personal. Silence again. Try not to escalate, 007, M said finally. Bond smiled at the city beyond the glass. I never do, sir, he said. Other people escalate around me. Bond dressed carefully the next morning. Not for danger. London was far too polite for that. But for movement. Comfortable shoes, neutral coat, no visible weapons, a man prepared to vanish into airports, trains, and cafes. Before leaving, he paused, lit one last cigarette, and watched the smoke rise. Park would be planning, Bond would be waiting. London remained calm, efficient, oblivious. Bond stepped out into the rain. Coat collar turned up, already moving east in his mind. Somewhere, a system was being assembled to erase him. Bond smiled. He never liked being organized. Chapter 3. Park moves west. Colonel Park did not travel. Not in the ordinary sense, at any rate. He did not pack a suitcase. He did not consult timetables. He did not stand in queues behind families in matching fleeces while a board official stamped his documents with theatrical disinterest. Colonel Park passed from one place to another the way a shadow passes over a wall. Silent, inevitable, and never quite acknowledged. Officially, he had not left North Korea. Officially, he had not even recovered. His name was not on any transport manifest. His photograph did not appear on any border record. If asked, and no one sensible asked, it could be truthfully stated that Colonel Park remained within the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, loyally overseeing the consequences of an unfortunate industrial accident caused by unpatriotic wiring and insufficient love of the Supreme Leader. Unofficially, Park departed in a sealed shipping container marked agricultural equipment. This amused him for exactly 3 seconds. He considered the irony neat, tidy, almost elegant, the sort of a bureaucratic absurdity that would have made him laugh if he had ever been the sort of a man to waste breath on laughter. He sat in darkness, knees drawn slightly up, surrounded by the claustrophobic smell of wood, metal, and stale air. There was a small oxygen supply attached to a gauge that clicked softly with each measured breath. A tiny emergency light glowed dimly, revealing the blunt edges of reality. Parker's immaculate coat, his polished shoes, and his expression, which never shifted from mild contempt. The container rocked gently as it was loaded. Park did not sway. He closed his eyes and returned, as he often did now. The bathroom, the humiliation, the betrayal, the explosion. If only Bond's head had been held in that cold porcelain vortex just a few moments longer, it could have made the most amusing anecdote for the Supreme Leader. Park's fingers flexed once, slow and deliberate. Revenge would not be a bullet. A bullet was crude. It solved nothing except breathing. No, Park wanted something better. He wanted Bond to be reduced, not killed, erased. The container moved by ship at first, then by truck, then by rail. Park knew this not because he could see it, but because he could hear it. The low thrum of engines, the shifting pitch of wheels on track, the subtle changes in air pressure and vibration. He had spent years listening for threats in corridors, listening for lies in voices, listening for weakness. Listening, he thought, was a discipline most men confused with silence. He remained perfectly still for the entirety of the journey, conserving oxygen and patience with equal devotion. When the container finally opened, the air that rushed in smelled different, saltier, damp, with a faint soreness of diesel and foreign cigarettes. A port, not North Korea. A man stood outside the container with a clipboard and nervous eyes. He wore a cheap suit and held himself like someone who had recently realized he was in trouble, but hadn't yet decided whether to run. "You are the consultant?"
the man asked in heavily accented English. Park stepped down from the container without haste, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve.
Yes, Park said calmly. The man swallowed. You were told you would be discreet. Park looked at him as one might look at a fly that had landed somewhere unfortunate. I'm not here to be seen, Park said. I'm here to be obeyed. The man nodded quickly. Of course, transportation is arranged. Lodging, cash, documents. Park accepted the envelope without looking inside. He already knew what it contained. His people were thorough, and the people he had paid were terrified. Park did not require loyalty. He required compliance. They walked briskly through the port. The man kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to shout his name, arrest him or shoot him. Park moved like a man strolling through his own office. A van waited near a warehouse, marked with a company name Park knew was false. Inside there were new clothes, European, a phone, a passport. Park opened the passport. The name was bland. The photograph was competent. He was now a man called Mr. Han, a logistics advisor, with a respectable background and no visible association with political violence, toilets, or obsession. Park closed the passport. For the first time since Ryongsong, he allowed himself a faint private satisfaction. It was not pride. It was the sensation of machinery clicking into place. He began in the only way he knew how, by building a system, in a rented room above a dull office block. Park laid out files, maps, and lists. He wrote names in careful, precise handwriting. He drew lines between companies and accounts. Shell Corporation, data mining firms, biometric startups, identity verification platforms. Park did not need to rebuild Project Kalima in a laboratory. He needed to rebuild it in the world. He had learned from Ryongsong machines could be destroyed, buildings could be burned, but modern life, the life of passports, bank accounts, travel or authorizations, algorithms, surveillance, that could not be burned so easily. A man could be destroyed there without a single explosion. A man could be made to vanish. Park began buying the pieces he needed. He met a Bulgarian financier who ran half his business through offshore accounts and the other half through personal intimidation. Park offered him money and a quiet threat about what would happen if he declined. The financier accepted both. He met a Czech technology executive who believed privacy was a luxury and security was a product. He listened politely, then explained in calm detail how easily a family could become vulnerable when the wrong people knew where to look. The executive became very eager to help. Park met a group of hackers in an abandoned factory outside Bratislava. They expected drama, threats, raised voices, perhaps even a pistol.
Park offered them a contract instead. You will do what I ask, he said, and you will be paid well. One of the hackers smirked. And if we don't? Park did not raise his voice. He simply leaned forward. If you refuse, Park said, you will discover how inconvenient it is to be unable to prove you exist. The smirk vanished. The hackers accepted the contract. Park did not enjoy cruelty. He enjoyed efficiency.
Weeks passed. Europe churned on, blissfully unaware. Tourists took photographs. Businessmen argued about budgets. Politicians lied with charming sincerity. Underneath it all, Park's system grew. He called it in private the veil. It was a simple concept. A man's life, Park understood, was a collection of confirmations. A passport that claimed his name, a bank account that recognized him, a record of employment, a history of movement, a medical file, a tax record, a digital footprint. Remove enough confirmations and the man became a problem. Remove all of them and the man became nothing. Park planned to remove James Bond, not with a bullet, not with a bomb, with paperwork, with databases, with quiet, precise erasure.
Bond would wake up one morning and find the world politely refusing to acknowledge him. He would be stopped at airports, denied at banks, suspected by police, abandoned by systems.
He would be forced to fight like an animal in a world designed for documents. And then, when he was desperate, when he was exhausted, when he was truly humiliated, Park would appear, and Bond would understand what real control felt like. One evening, Park stood by a window in his rented room and watched snow begin to fall over the city. Somewhere far away in London, Bond was probably drinking, smoking, pretending he had finished his mission. Park flicked on a cigarette and inhaled slowly. The smoke steadied him. It reminded him of discipline, of ritual, of patience. He exhaled and watched the smoke dissolve into darkness. Soon, he thought, soon, Mr. Bond, you will discover what it feels like to be drowned without water. He crushed the cigarette into the ashtray, turned back to his desk and began writing the final list. Names, dates, accounts, routes, and at the top, underlined twice, Bond, James.
Chapter 4. The Woman in Berlin.
Berlin in late autumn had the decency not to pretend. The city wore its age openly, stone darkened by history. Pavement slick with rain, leaves gathering in corners like secrets no one had bothered to sweep away. It smelled of wet iron, coffee, and old arguments. Bond liked it immediately. He stood on the bridge over the Spree with his coat collar turned up, cigarette cup against the wind. The flame flared, struggled, then settled. He inhaled slowly, letting the smoke anchor him to the moment. Berlin was a city that understood division. It understood walls. It understood what happened when systems decided people were inconvenient. Park, Bond thought, would feel at home here. Bond flicked ash into the river and watched it vanish without ceremony. Still smoking? A voice said behind him. Bond didn't turn. Still judging, he replied. Dr. Kim Sora stood a few paces back, hands resting lightly on the stone railing. She wore a dark coat, sensible shoes, and the expression of someone who had learned not to expect welcome. The wind tugged at her hair, loosening it from its careful restraint. You shouldn't be here, Bond said. Neither should you, she replied calmly. He turned then, taking her in properly. She looked thinner, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, but there was lightness too, a subtle loosening, as though something heavy had been set down at last. You left Pyongyang, Bond said. Yes. That was brave.
No, Sora said. It was arithmetic. Bond raised an eyebrow. I calculated the probability of survival, she continued. Staying was no longer logical. Bond smiled faintly. Logic rarely gets the credit it deserves.
They stood side by side, looking out over the water. A tour boat passed beneath them, full of people pointing cameras at a city they believed had already finished its story. Bond lit another cigarette. Park is alive, he said quietly. I know, Sora replied. He contacted me. Bond's head turned sharply. When? 2 weeks ago, she said. A message, very polite, very precise. He congratulated me on my escape. Bond exhaled smoke slowly. That's his idea of humor. He wanted to know where you were, she added. And you told him? I told him, she said calmly, that if he wanted you, he should follow the trail of broken systems and defended institutions. Bond laughed softly. That narrows it down to half the continent. She reached into her coat,
and produced a thin folder, edges softened by handling. "He isn't rebuilding Kalima," she said. "He's moved on." Bond flipped it open. Inside were company names, flowcharts, and transaction logs. The kind of paperwork that looked harmless until it ruined your life. "Identity platforms," Bond murmured. "Verification services, data brokers." "Eraser," Sora said. "He's building a way to make people disappear without touching them." Bond closed the folder. "Subtle," he said, "and deeply irritating." I figured it detached itself from the shadows at the far end of the bridge. A man in a dark coat moving with too much purpose for a tourist. Bond felt it immediately. The prickle between the shoulder blades, the shift in the air. He stepped sideways, casually, as though adjusting his stance against the wind. The man lunged. Bond pivoted, hooked an arm, and set neatly over the railing. There was a splash, a startled curse and polish, and then the river reclaimed its peace. Sora stared. "You always do that so casually," she said. Bond flicked ash into the water. Berlin has a long tradition of people falling into rivers for political reasons. They walked away together. They sat later in a small cafe tucked between a bookshop and a shuttered record store. The windows fogged with warmth. The coffee was strong enough to qualify as a stimulant. Bond approved. Sora watched the door while Bond smoked by the window. "He's exhilarating," she said. "Park. He's no longer testing." Bond nodded. "He's impatient." "He's frightened," Sora corrected. "Men like him don't escalate unless something has slipped out of their control." Bond smiled. "That would be me." She studied him. "He isn't trying to kill you." "No," Bond agreed. "That would be too easy." "He wants you visible," she said. "Then invisible." Bond crushed the cigarette into the saucer. "That's always been my problem," he said. "I don't vanish when expected." Sora hesitated, then asked the questions she's been circling. "What will you do?" Bond leaned back, folding his hands. "I'll let him pull the thread," he said. "Then I'll follow it back to the man holding the needle." "And if he succeeds?" she asked quietly. "If he erases you?" Bond smiled. "Not cocky, not careless, just certain." "Then," he said, "I'll introduce myself again." Outside, Berlin moved on. Trams rattling, lights flickering on, history pretending not to watch. Somewhere in the city, parks, systems ticked forward another precise step. Bond reached for another cigarette. "Stay close," he said to Sora. "Berlin is about to become inconvenient." She nodded. "I'm used to that." They sat in silence for a moment, smoke curling between them, both aware that the calm was already ending. Chapter 5. Park's Trap. Prague was beautiful in the way traps often were. The city wore its history lightly. Spires and bridges reflected in the river, narrow streets polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, cafes glowing warmly against the early winter dusk. It was the sort of place where men believed themselves anonymous, simply because so many others had walked there before. James Bond arrived by train just after midday, carrying a single overnight bag in the faint persistent sense that something had already begun without bothering to inform him. He checked into a small hotel near Old Town Square, under a perfectly valid name, paid in cash, and accepted the key with a nod that suggested confidence rather than caution. The clerk smiled. The smile lingered a fraction too long. Bond noticed. He always did. His room overlooked the narrow streets where tourists drifted past in clumps, following guides and brollies like migrating birds. Bond unpacked methodically, laid out his tools, and then paused, cigarette halfway to his lips. Something felt wrong.
Not danger. Not yet. More like friction. Like reality hesitating when it shouldn't. He lit the cigarette anyway. The first sign was the bank. Bond stood at the counter of a discreet private branch, exchanging pleasantries with a man who already clearly been trained to be polite to unpleasant people. Bond handed over his card. The man frowned, typed, frowned again. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," the clerk said. "There appears to be an issue." Bond smiled. "There always is." The clerk tried another terminal, then another. "I'm afraid your account is restricted." Bond raised an eyebrow. "By whom?" The clerk hesitated. "By the system." Bond nodded. "Of course it is." He retrieved the card, thanked the man, and left without fuss. Fuss, Bond had learned, rarely improved systems. Outside, the city carried on. Bond stopped at a cash machine. Transaction denied. He tried another card. Transaction denied. "Well," Bond murmured. "That's irritating."
By late afternoon, the irritation had developed structure. His phone refused to connect to secure networks. His hotel key malfunctioned twice before working again. A pair of uniformed officers paused when they saw him crossing a square, spoke quietly into a radio, and then decided against approaching him. Decided. Bond felt it then, the unmistakable tightening of the net. Park.
Bond ducked into a cafe, ordered coffee, and sat with his back to the wall. He lit a cigarette and watched the room reflected in the window. Two tourists arguing over a map. A waiter pretending not to listen. A man at the bar with the wrong shoes. Bond smiled faintly. Park was no longer watching from afar. Park was engaged. Bond's phone buzzed. A message. Untraceable. Minimalist. "You are still visible. This will change." Bond sipped his coffee. "Oh, Park," he said softly. "You are enjoying yourself."
The police came an hour later, politely. They approached him as he exited a bookshop, badges visible, hands relaxed. Professionals, no urgency, no aggression. "Sir," one of them said in careful English, "we would like you to come with us for a moment." Bond smiled. "On what grounds?" The officer glanced at his tablet. "Identity irregularities." Bond nodded. "I have those occasionally." The officer did not smile.
Bond took a step back, just enough to suggest cooperation, then pivoted sharply, slipping sideways into the crowd. The chase was brief, chaotic, and extremely inconvenient for several innocent pedestrians. Bond vaulted a barrier, knocked over a display of postcards, before accidentally launching a coffee cup from a man's hands, which hit Bond on the legs like a scalding shower, and ducked into a narrow alley that smelled of damp stones and regret. Ahead of him, a sign swung slightly in the breeze. "Toilets." Bond groaned. Of course. The public restroom was tiled, narrow, and unforgiving. Park had chosen it carefully. Bond barely had time to register the presence of another man before the door slammed shut behind him. Colonel Park stepped out from the cubicle, immaculate as ever. His expression, one of a polite satisfaction. "You came," Park said. Bond glanced around
and brushed at the coffee on his trousers. "I'm afraid you don't excite me that much, Colonel," he said.
Park inclined his head. "You humiliated me," Park said. This seemed appropriate. Bond rolled his shoulders. "Let me guess," he said. "You've frozen my accounts, flagged my identity, and convinced several governments I do not exist." "Yes," Park said calmly. "You are now a problem." Bond smiled. "I always was." They did not fight immediately. Park preferred to explain. "I will remove you." Park said, "Not violently. That would be crude. I will make the world refuse you." Bond leaned against a sink, cigarette still unlit between his fingers. "You will get bored," Bond said. "Systems always do." Park's eyes flickered. "No," he said, "I will watch." Bond lit the cigarette. The flame flared brightly in the mirror. So will I, Bond replied. The door burst open. The fight was fast, brutal, and entirely lacking in dignity. Tiles cracked. A mirror shattered. Someone screamed outside. Bond emerged moments later. Coat torn, knuckles split, breathing hard. Park was gone. But on the porcelain of the sink, scratched carefully with a blade, were words written in precise English. You still breathe. I still wait. Bond stared at the message for a long moment, then he laughed. Softly, genuinely. Oh, Park, he said, you finally made this interesting. He crushed the cigarette into the sink, turned, and vanished into the city, a man without documents, money or permission, and entirely unconcerned. Chapter 6. The Hunt Turns. By nightfall, James Bond officially did not exist. This was not metaphorical, it was logistical. He stood beneath the arch of an old bridge on the edge of Prague, the river sliding past in black silence, and took inventory. No usable credit, no legal identity, no safe passage through borders. His phone connected only intermittently, like a disloyal friend deciding whether to answer. Park had been thorough.
Bond smiled faintly. Thoroughness, he had learned, was often the enemy of imagination. He leaned against the cold stone, out of sight of passing cars, and lit a cigarette. The flame cupped against the wind, flaring briefly before settling. He inhaled slowly, letting the smoke fill his lungs, letting the moment stretch. The world narrowed to simple things: breath, heat, control. Park smoked when he planned. Bond smoked when he adjusted. The cigarette steadied him. Park wanted Bond frantic, visible, scrabbling for documents and permission. Bond intended to disappoint him. The safe house was not officially a safe house. It was an abandoned bookshop near the river, the kind of place that had survived too many political systems to believe in any of them. The sign above the door was faded, the windows cluttered with obsolete philosophies and dust. Bond slipped inside without hurry and locked the door behind him. The basement smelled of mold, old paper, and forgotten arguments. Bond descended, closed the door, and switched on the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. He set his bag down carefully, removed his coat, and sat on a crate. Only then did he light another cigarette. Smoke curled upward, softening the hard lines of the room. Bond watched it thoughtfully, exhaling through his nose. Park had built a system, which meant Park had left seams. Bond stubbed the cigarette out and activated the concealed terminal hidden behind a false shelf. M, he said quietly. The line crackled once. Yes, M replied. We were beginning to wonder how long you'd last. Bond smiled. You underestimate my paperwork tolerance. You've been erased, M said. Accounts frozen, travel alerts triggered. Interpol has you flagged as a person of interest. Bond leaned back. Park is showing off, he said. He wants me aware. Yes, M agreed. And he's good. Very good. Bond lit another cigarette. Good systems rely on trust, Bond said. Trust is fragile, M sighed. Bond. I won't destabilize Prague, Bond said, but I will destabilize Park. There was a pause. Unofficially, M said carefully, we have not noticed if certain digital assets stopped functioning. Bond smiled. Much appreciated. Bond went underground. Not dramatically, not with gunfire or disguises. Quietly. He used cash, favors, and old debts. He lent on people who preferred inconvenience to prison. He spoke to men who lived between systems and women who knew which databases lied. A Bulgarian data broker with an unhealthy interest in yachts lost access to his offshore accounts for 10 minutes and became extremely cooperative. A Latvian fintech executive discovered that his identity verification platform
suddenly failed to recognize his own face and agreed to share access logs immediately. A hacker collective outside Bratislava accepted Bond's offer for money, alcohol, and the opportunity to irritate Colonel Parks immensely. Bond smoked through all of it. He smoked while listening. He smoked while thinking. He smoked while watching systems collapse one polite refusal at a time. Parks' veil began to tear. By midnight, Erasmus Clean Identity Solutions was bleeding data. By 1 o'clock, Parks' shell companies were arguing with each other. At 2, Bond paused, stepped outside into the cold and lit another cigarette. Snow began to fall. Bond looked up at it, mused. Still dramatic? He murmured. His phone vibrated. A message. Istanbul, sunrise. Bond laughed softly. Of course, he said. Some men can't resist the stage.
He crushed the cigarette into the snow and watched the ember die with a hiss.
Park felt it immediately. Systems screamed silently when disturbed. Sudden delays, inexplicable errors, loyal subordinates growing nervous. Park stood in his rented room, cigarette burning untouched between his fingers, watching error reports cascade across a screen. Bond was dismantling him. Not wildly,
not angrily, methodically. Park smiled thinly. Excellent. This was how it should end.
Before dawn, Bond boarded a night fight under a name that no longer existed in any official capacity. He slept briefly, cigarette tucked until behind his ear, like an old habit waiting its turn. As the plane descended towards Istanbul, Bond looked out at the dark water below and allowed himself a moment of anticipation. Park wanted a final accounting. Bond intended to give him one. Preferably with witnesses. He reached for a cigarette. As the seatbelt sign pinged on, some habits, he reflected, survived every system. Chapter 7. Final Accounting. Istanbul revealed itself slowly, as though deciding whether James Bond deserved it. The city lay under a low metallic sky, rain drifting in thin sheets that softened edges without forgiving mistakes. Minarets cut through the mist like accusations. Ferries moved across the Bosphorus with the calm assurance of things that had seen empires come and go and were unimpressed by individual vendettas. Bond arrived early. He always did. There's an advantage. Bond had learned to being the first man at the bar when history is about to repeat itself. He took a seat in the quiet lounge of an old hotel overlooking the water, the kind of place that still believed cocktails were a matter of pride rather than speed. The bartender approached without asking questions. This, Bond approved of immediately. "A martini," Bond said. Vodka, shaken, very cold. The bartender nodded gravely and went to work. Bond removed his coat, settled back and lit a cigarette. The smoke rose lazily, curling toward the ceiling fan like a thought refusing to hurry. Outside, rain traced paths down the windows, blurring the lights of the city into the abstract streaks. Park would be watching. Men like Park always watched. Bond inhaled, exhaled, and allowed himself the indulgence of calm, unnerved enemies more than anger ever could. The martini arrived, clear, perfect, rimmed with frost.
Bond took a sip. It tasted of order. Good, he murmured. He drank slowly, deliberately, letting the alcohol settle without dulling him. This was not celebration. This was preparation. He finished the martini, stubbed out the cigarette, and stood. The rooftop was higher than Bond expected. He stepped out into the rain and wind. The city spread beneath him in a sweep of lights and water. The Bosphorus glimmered darkly, reflecting nothing it could be held accountable for. Colonel Park stood near the edge, back straight, coat immaculate, cigarette burning between his fingers. He had chosen the place well. "Mr. Bond," Park said without turning. "You came." Bond approached at an unhurried pace. I'm afraid you still don't excite me that way, Bond quipped, but it would be rude to have declined your invite. Park turned. Up close, Bond saw what obsession had done. Park looked thinner, sharper, worn down by the constant pressure of control. His eyes were bright, focused, alive in a way that suggested this moment had sustained him through sleepless nights. You destroyed my work, Park said calmly. Bond shrugged. It was very silly work. Park's jaw tightened.
You humiliated me, Park continued. You made me ridiculous. Bond flicked on a cigarette, sheltering the flame from the rain. I tried to drown you in the toilet, Park added. You laughed. Bond exhaled smoke. I have a nervous disposition, he said. It manifests in inappropriate humor. They circled each other slowly, rain slicking the concrete beneath their feet. I erased you, Park said. The world rejected you. Yes, Bond said, I noticed. And yet, Park continued, you survived. Bond smiled faintly. You underestimated boredom, he said. Systems get bored, people don't. Park lunged. The fight was immediate and vicious. No grand flourishes, no elegance, just fists, rain, and long-held resentment. Park struck with precision, each movement efficient, punishing. Bond took the blows, gave them back harder, teeth clenched, breath sharp in the cold air. Park drove Bond back against the low wall. Bond slipped, recovered, headbutted Park squarely in the nose. Bone cracked, blood mingled with rain. You think chaos wins? Park spat. No, Bond replied, driving his elbow into Park's ribs. I think it interrupts. They crabbled, slipping, boots skidding dangerously close to the edge. The city waited below, with infinite patience. Park swung wildly. Once, twice, rage finally breaking through discipline. Bond stepped aside. Park's foot slipped. For a moment everything slowed. Bond saw it all in a Park's eyes. Shock, anger, understanding, the realization that control once lost did not politely return.
Bond reached out, grabbing Park roughly by the hair. He could have let him fall, but where would be the fun in that, he thought. Looking down into the swirling darkness of the Bosphorus, he had something else in mind. Still clutching at Park's hair, Bond dragged him down the stairs into the bar. A few guests looked up, disturbed from their convivial evening. Excuse us, Bond said, looking Park in the eye with an evil glint, both of them soaked from the rain. We are looking for the gentleman's bathroom. An elderly man pointed at a door. Ah, thank you very much. Park said nothing. He could guess what was coming. Bond was impressed with the bar's bathroom. It was almost glamorous. Gold taps, marble surfaces, even a curtain at the small window. It was almost too nice for what Bond had in mind, however it would have to do.
There were 4 stalls. Pick a number, Colonel. Go to hell, Park hissed. Oh, I do apologize, mused Bond. But I do believe that is your destination. Do send me a postcard, won't you? He swung his tall door open, kicking Park hard in the backside. Park was thrown forward, head first. His eyes widened as the freezing water made contact with the face. He didn't get time to react. Bond grabbed his legs, holding him forcefully, upside down. There was no escape. Still Park tried, struggling like a fish, floundering without water.
Bond didn't speak, just casually flushing once to make sure the bowl was filled. Eventually all movement stopped. He let go of Park's legs, watching as they slumped to the floor. He felt Park's pulse. Nothing. Park was finally dead. Bond left the stall, closing the door behind him, out of order. He grinned to himself. Looking in the mirror, he straightened his tie and washed his hands. Perfect, he said to himself. He went back into the bar, different seat, same view. The bartender raised an eyebrow. Another martini? Bond considered the question carefully. Yes, he said. Why not? He lit another cigarette. The drink arrived. Bond lifted it in a small private toast to the window. To order, he murmured, such as it is. He drank. Outside, Istanbul continued its long, complicated life.
Ferries moved, lights flickered. Somewhere, a system failed quietly and was replaced by another. Bond finished his martini, stubbed out the ash of his cigarette and stood. The world would turn again soon enough. It always did. And James Bond, agent, survivor, nuisance, would be ready when it did. Chapter 8. Smoke on the water. The sea was calm in the way that suggested it was merely resting between arguments. James Bond sat on the terrace of a small hotel that preferred not to appear on maps, a place that existed comfortably beyond briefings, cables, and denials. The table was iron, the chair unforgiving, the view immaculate. The sort of setting that encouraged honesty, or at least the illusion of it. A martini rested by his hand, condensation tracing a slow, unhurried path down the glass. He hadn't specified how it should be made. It had arrived correctly anyway. Bond flicked on a cigarette. The flame flared briefly in the dusk, then settled. He inhaled, exhaled, and watched the smoke drift out over the water, where it thinned and vanished, as all things eventually did. Park was gone, not vanished. Bond had never trusted the word. But concluded, closed, filed away by history, under unfortunate man with unfortunate ideas. Systems would continue without him. New men would rise, new plans would be built on the same brittle foundations. That was the nature of things. Bond took a sip of his drink and allowed himself a moment of stillness. Berlin, Prague, Istanbul in the rain, and Sora. She stood in the doorway behind him now, barefoot, coat gone, hair loose around her shoulder. The night breeze lifted it slightly, softening the edges of a woman who had spent too long holding the world together with discipline alone. "You're brooding," she said. Bond smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. She crossed the terrace and took the cigarette from his fingers without asking, extinguishing it in the ashtray with a decisiveness that amused him. "You shouldn't smoke so much," she said. "I don't," Bond replied. "I smoke precisely enough." She shook her head, but there was no real disapproval in it. They went inside. The room was lit only by the city beyond the curtains. Istanbul reduced to soft gold and shadow. Rain tapped gently against the glass, no longer urgent, just present. Bond loosened his cufflinks, jacket discarded over a chair. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway damp, where rain had soaked through earlier. He looked, Sora thought, like a man who had survived something and had no intention of explaining it. She watched him from the edge of the bed. "You could still disappear," she said quietly. Bond glanced at her, then finished unbuttoning his shirt, deliberately, unhurried. So could you. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she rose, crossed the room, and closed the remaining distance herself. Her fingers found the open fabric of his shirt, resting briefly against his chest, as though confirming something already decided. "You're very bad at stopping," she said. Bond's hand settled at her waist, light but certain. "Yes," he replied. "It's one of my more consistent flaws." She leaned in first, not hurried, not uncertain. Her forehead rested briefly against his, their breaths close enough to blur the space between thought and action. The kiss was unremarkable in the way imported things often were. No urgency, no drama, just warmth, pressure, and the quiet certainty that neither of them was pretending anymore. Later, much later, the city had softened into background sound, distant traffic, water moving, life continuing without instructions. Bond lay back against the pillows, one arm behind his head, the other resting lightly at her side. He reached for a cigarette, thought better of it, and let his hands fall again. For once, restraint felt natural. Sora traced idle patterns on his chest,
thoughtful rather than anxious. "Will you disappear again?" she asked. Bond considered the ceiling, the quiet, the weight of the moment. "Yes," he said honestly, "but not tonight." She nodded, accepting that for what it was. Not a promise, but not a lie either. Outside the rain slowed, inside the light dimmed. For a few hours at least, the world would wait. And James Bond, agent, survivor, nuisance, allowed himself the rare luxury of staying exactly where he was.
In a cold where the mountains keep secrets, where the wires hum prayers to the state, a shadow walks through silent corridors, and history learns it's already too late. Ash in the snow, broken glass in the morning, steel and ambition lie torn from their place. You came like a joke in a world built on orders, and left me with fire, and left me with disgrace. They told me the system was perfect. They told me control never bends. But one man walked through it smiling, and now every silence has ends. North by North Korea, where the lies freeze in stone, where the truth needs permission and guilt gets a throne. You don't see the blade till it's already inside. You don't hear the scream in a country that lies. North by North Korea, where revenge has a face, where patience is a weapon and time is a cage. You took what was mine, now I'm taking your name, and the world will remember who finished the game. In London you drink like the war never touched you, like ghosts are just stories you tell with a grin. But every reflection is slightly dishonest, and every escape is a beautiful sin. I count every step that you think no one notices, every door that you close, every trail that you burn. You think you're the hunter, you think you're untouchable, but systems are patient, and so am I, and I learn. They call you a weapon with manners, they call me a man made of rules, but rules are just knives with good timing, and even gods bleed like fools. North by North Korea, where the snow hides the bones, where loyalty's measured in unmarked phones. You don't see the hand till it tightens the chain. You don't feel the trap till it whispers your name. North by North Korea, you're quiet as loud, where the past is a sentence, not something you're proud. You took what was mine, now I'm taking your name, and the world will remember who finished the day. No flags, no speeches, no heroes survive, just men in their shadows and carefully chosen goodbyes. You live on instinct, I live on design. You call it luck, I call it time. North by North Korea, where the promises rot and the secrets go deep. You don't outrun ghosts when the ghosts know your face. You don't win this game, you just choose the race. North by North Korea, let the cold world agree. You were never the storm, you were only the sea. You took what was mine, now I'm taking your name, and the world will remember who finished the game. In the end, there are no witnesses, only ruins, only silence, only history.